So getting started, the first thing I want to talk to you guys about is the okay. The one thing I want to talk to you guys about is, do you remember that conversation we had a long time ago when we canceled the second take home? And I was like, it's going to put two things right next to each other, but if you guys are okay with that, we'll move forward with it. Well, we're here. So, term paper next week, next week, next Friday, right? 11:59. Week after that is the second take home. Right? So just throwing that out there in case you guys need to budget some time, right? Because you know how much work the take homes are, right? If you need to make sure to free up some time, you get a chance to get working on the term paper a little earlier if you want to. I also have now posted the second take home. So this is now up on Blackboard. The instructions are the exact same as the last take home. So that also means that if you did not receive the grade you would like on your first take home, make sure you look over the notes and see why. That way you can improve your score. Okay, the questions are, so for question 1, we had several articles in class discussing, we had several articles and class discussions exploring inequality. How is inequality within nations, specifically the United States, changing? How is inequality between countries changing? How do our articles speak to these changes? So we did 2 weeks on inequality. So essentially it's just looking for you to reflect on what to take away, right? How is our world changing in terms of inequality? I broke, and if you noticed, last time we had 3 questions, each of which was a page long. This time we have 4 questions, but 2 of them are half a page. And that's because the race and ethnicity sections, the papers are quite different from one another. The articles that we read were quite different from one another. So I broke them apart, right? So for question 2.5 a page, discuss colorblind racism. Oh, first of all, was there any questions on question 1? People have any questions for that first question? Our question 2 is discuss colorblind racism. How does colorblind racism differ from more overt forms of racism in the past? How does Sumner utilize the concept, and how else are you supposed to dress up like a black guy? How might you apply these insights to help you understand racism, either in the media or in everyday life in America today? Make sense? Well, third question, as discussed in our reading and in our class discussions, we live in a global era of rising xenophobia. How is this rising xenophobia being utilized against asylum seekers? How can these new hostilities be understood? How can we see this trend here in the United States? Any questions on that? And our last one, utilizing our articles and class discussions, explore how our current historical moment reflects changes in both gender inequality and the culture surrounding gender. What was gender like in the past? What do you think it will be like in the future? So obviously the second question is not something that we've directly talked about in class. None of our articles specifically said what they expected gender to look like in the future. So I'm looking for you to kind of like talk about your expectations on the basis of current trends. Right? So your answers are entirely yours for that last part of the question. So don't think that you don't have anything in mind at all. So. All those clear? Wonderful. Great. Cool. As always, if you have questions as you get started, let me know. So today we're gonna continue on in our article on disability. By the way, did campus end up actually being closed by the time class ended?
I'm not even sure.
What's that?
I'm not sure.
Not even sure.
Well, like Rocky's copies closed early because they were worried that like nobody would be able to leave
Yeah.
campus by the time like it was more like they wanted things to shut down early just so you could just like get out of campus before the parade.
Yeah. So I probably made the right decision then. 'Cause you were right before this, so I'm guessing you got out
Yes,
early.
well, kind of. Well, I did get out of work and then they told me I'm being quarantined. So,
Well,
which I'm not in
congratulations on
quarantine
not
anymore.
being quarantined anymore.
Thanks. That result came out quick. Like when I got tested for COVID back in June, like it took like 2 weeks for the test to get back. Like and
Yeah.
by then it was like, all right, like my incubation period is over. But yeah, it was nice.
Yeah, I know the tests have gotten quicker for sure. Okay, so where did we leave off? I know in this class we left off in the middle of this article, right? What have we talked about so far? So the article that I'm looking at right now is the risk of spectral politics, the risk in the spectral politics of disability. So tell me what we talked about last Wednesday.
So we basically like defined what spectrum means. Like that was the last thing we did.
So, but let's reiterate a little. So we get back into it. What were some of the things we talked about? Yeah.
We're talking a little bit about mental health and kind of like what goes into it, past, present, future, something like that.
Yeah.
We're talking a little bit about schizophrenia, right?
What were we saying about it? Yeah.
Did you say that like schizophrenia is like a catch-all term that you may or may not know was like accurate or not?
Yeah. Did you have something
I
else?
was gonna say, like, you're talking about diversity, like, not being fully based on biology, the developmental biology.
Yeah. Are those the things people glean? Yeah, so I think that's a good starting point for us to get into it. So it's that idea of that there's been a change in how we talk about biological issues, right? That they no longer are thought of as solely biological, right? But as this sort of weird intermix of both biology and environment, right? And we were talking about, and this is where we ended with the spectral thing, that changes how we feel about disabilities. What was the change? Did people catch that? What the change was and how we feel about disabilities? There's two different outcomes. We got that far, right? Or didn't we? Did we start reading on page 32 here? Is that the right page number? No, I don't think that is. I think it's the one before that. Yeah, did we read this on page 31 here? Where it does this transition where it talks about basically disability rights. Did we do that? And then yet, and then it has this other outcome of that. Do you remember that? So when we're talking about biological, we no longer look at biological differences as solely biological. One of the outcomes of that is that allows essentially people who advocate for people with disability, right, the ability to advocate for better environments for people who are disabled, right? So like, if part of what causes people with schizophrenia to act schizophrenic is their environment, right? People advocating for a better environment for schizophrenics allows them to improve their conditions, right? So that's one of the outcomes of this change, this spectral philosophy on disability. Yeah, by the way, we should back up for a second. what was the significance of the spectral thing? So there's two meanings of the word spectral in our very postmodern way. Our author means both. What's one meaning of the word spectral? What's a specter?
Like there's different degrees to it.
So yeah, spectral could mean spectrum, right? That like, there's degrees, right? Do you guys remember talking about that idea of like, that people say things in colloquially, the fact that we view disabilities on the spectrum is now, like, we will often drop phrases like people will say, oh, I'm just a little bit OCD, right? A truly biological understanding of OCD is you are either OCD or you are not OCD, right? But we understand disabilities because of this change from biology to biology and environment is something on a spectrum, right? The people have degrees of it rather than a sort of yes, no. Remember that? So that's one way that we see the word specter, right? Or spectrum, spectral. There's another meaning to the word spectral. Postmodern wordplay. Yeah.
It means like kind of like haunting, like a ghost.
Yeah. The other is a ghost, right? So like, well, on one end we get this sort of more inclusive understanding of disability that happens on the spectrum, where people associate with disability. In another sense, right, we get the specter of disability, the ghost of disability, right? People feel more haunted by the idea of being disabled. And the reason why is before, if you had your genes determined your disabilities, right, it was a one-to-one thing, right? So were you specifically worried about having a disability you didn't have? No, right? And on the other hand, like now that it's this sort of gradated thing, you have it, you could have the genes for it your whole life, you may never know, right? Depending on your environment, there's a certain environmental factor. I'll give you an example of how the environmental factor things works. So you guys know what epilepsy is, right?
I do.
What do epileptics do? What do they get? They get seizures, right? Yeah, if you take certain subsets of the population, it's related with epilepsy. And the reason why is certain conditions make things come out. If you move around too much, and you have a genetic disposition to epilepsy, you're more likely to have actual epileptic seizures, right? If there's a relationship for people being overeducated and having epilepsy, right? And the reason why is because certain ways of thinking, certain forms of stress, right, et cetera, actually, trigger, right? So all these correlates, right, in your life trigger your disability. So the article's kind of wanting to say is that, on the one hand, this spectral understanding of disability that we have is positive, right? It's positive because it helps disability advocates, it helps people improve their conditions, but then it's also negative, right? In that we often blame individuals for their disabilities. Right? That because the literature says, oh, it's environmental because we live in America and we don't really believe in environmental. This is a whole literature on Americans don't really believe in environmental influences on people's behavior. They have a tendency to relate everything back down to individuals. That gets interpreted as sort of like you have a choice, right? So in other words, it's your lifestyle choices that will make you susceptible. So there becomes a paranoia of disability. and also an increasing harsh attitude towards people who are disabled.
So you're saying, is you trying to argue the fact that like it's positive because like we can identify it to help improve like our environment or situations that we're in.
Yeah. Yeah, it's positive for that reason, and also like the fact that it's environmental, kind of like, in some ways, there's sort of an irony here, it reduces the stigma, right? Like if we all feel like there's a bit of like disability inside of us, it reduces it, right? And also like the idea that basically like those living conditions, right? It's good rhetorical ground for people who are disability advocates, right? So that's part of it as well. Okay, so that's kind of the way our author wants to talk about disability. Let's get the sperm bank stuff in here. So what's going on in the sperm bank? What's our story surrounding the sperm bank?
Wasn't there a man that like the dream man, so to speak, and after they collected his sperm, they found out that he had like a bunch of criminal records, along with a bunch of disabilities and mental illnesses, and turned out to be a complete opposite of what they thought he was.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and did we talk yet about this case, them suing the company, the sperm bank company? Did we talk about this yet? This is part. Did we talk about the sperm bank stuff at all yet?
Yeah.
Okay, just seeing where we're at. Let's take a look at. Page numbers. Let's take a look on page 30. If we already read this aloud, let me know. If you read this at the bottom of page 30 where it talks about the case Collins and Hansen assertion, you read that? Okay. Sorry. Sometimes between the two classes I get them like flipped in my head and it gets hard to figure out which one's which. Okay, so with the case, right? Did anybody who had children did people catch how many children this person had? Is this in your resume? 36, yeah. This person had 36 children through the sperm bank. How many of them actually displayed any conditions that this person has? None. Right? So what is being sued over? So you have 36 healthy children born via the sperm bank. What's being sued over? Let me grab it.
Because even though they're fine right now, it doesn't guarantee that they'll be healthy in the future.
Yeah. Just because they're healthy now doesn't guarantee that they'll be healthy in the future. Right? Do you guys see the connection to spectral disability in that? Go ahead.
It's like they're suing her for the risk.
Yeah. It's like they're suing them in the risk. And what's the implicit assumption there? What shouldn't patient, whatever number it was, what shouldn't he be doing?
Donating?
What's that?
You shouldn't be donating.
Well, even beyond donating, what do we know about his? What's the statement about his sperm then, if you will? Not to like. Sometimes there's no good way of phrasing it. that case makes. So what are we saying if we sue this company for providing this person's sperm? What are we assuming about that person's sperm?
That's inferior.
That it's inferior.
Yeah, that it shouldn't be used, right? Which implies what about him?
He's inferior.
That he's inferior and
Shouldn't be allowed to have children.
he shouldn't be allowed to have children. Right? So if you want to think about it like, and so like our author's using this case as a foil to talk about attitude of sperm banks towards disabled people. Did anybody catch this? They give this example of a lesbian deaf couple. Did you guys catch this?
Yep.
Did anybody catch this detail? Yeah, what was it?
They were specifically trying to find a donor that was deaf
Yeah.
to create their child.
Yeah, that both of these people were part of the deaf community, meaning that they didn't have a cochlear implant, that they lived in deaf communities that were specifically geared towards people who communicated with sign language, and they wanted to have a child that represented their own genetics, right? So they wanted to find a sperm donor who was deaf, and what happened?
People got mad.
People got mad and the courts kept them from having a deaf child. Do you guys get the idea here? Like, how does that connect in with eugenics, where we kind of started, right? Because we already talked about eugenics a little, right? That's where
Yeah,
we
we
started. Yep. How does that connect to eugenics?
So I guess with eugenics trying to make the superior human, if they're trying to create a child that has a disability, it's going to just go against everything eugenics is trying to fight for.
Yeah, and so thinking about eugenics is a scare word, like people dislike eugenics, but what they're saying is that latently there's kind of a eugenics philosophy to the sperm bank, right? The idea that, like, is it even necessarily, I think we talked about this a little, is it necessarily even that sperm at a sperm bank doesn't have to have disabilities? It goes further than that. They may catch some of the weird things that they require.
Wasn't it like height?
Yeah, sperm banks require you to be over 5'8". 5'8's actually fairly tall. Right? Like, there's a lot of people who aren't 5'8". You know, and is there anything wrong with being under 5'8"?
No.
Are you under 5'8"?
I might be.
What's that?
I might be.
You might be. No, there isn't. Right? They also like, some sperm banks, they like to hold like larger quantities, because basically like this is a market-driven thing. Some sperm banks only allow certain numbers of people to donate with certain skin color, certain hair color, certain eye color. Right? So what do you think's best to be if you're going to donate sperm? What do you think sells the best? What does the market decide? Who should reproduce? Anyone want to guess?
All white male.
Tall, white males. What else?
Blue eyes.
Blue eyes. Blonde hair. Right? Highly educated. Right? So essentially what this is like the idea is that sperm banks, if you get sperm from a sperm bank, it's almost like you're trying to guarantee that you have like a better person, right? And I'm putting that in scare quotes, right? That you have a better person. That's the eugenics logic of it, right? Make sense? Okay, I want to tie this in with a different literature, rather than just the literature on eugenics. And it's partially because this is our medical week, or last week was technically our medical week. This is the class on medical sociology. And there's a huge literature on something called bear life, which I think what you're seeing here is itself a form of bear life, a logic of bear life. And bear being B-A-R-E, not B-E-A-R. And so, the Bear Life literature started by somebody by the name of Giorgio Agamben in the 1990s, is interested in how politics is increasingly interested in questions of life itself. That before modernity, life is outside of politics. So like, before modernity, the government generally doesn't care or doesn't make a statement about what lives is legitimate or not. So what I mean by this is I think if we think back to Agamben grows out of, we talked a lot in our classes about Michel Foucault, right? And Foucault, particularly like if you guys remember back to the carceral society thing. You guys remember that? What was the idea of the carceral society? What is society increasingly becoming like? I'll give you a word, a clue. The word is carceral. Carceral society. Yeah, increasingly the world is becoming like, everyday life is becoming more like a prison. Do you guys remember how it's becoming like a prison? Do you guys remember what the prison looked like that Foucault was talking about? He talked about the panopticon, right? What does a panopticon look like?
Wasn't like the ever-looming like idea of you are judging me, so I think I'm putting on clothes that I want, but really it's more kind of to seek your approval or seek your whatever.
Yeah, it's this constantly being watched thing, right? So the idea was panopticon was that it had a tower in the middle, right, and the cells around it, and the prisoners never knew if they were being watched, so they always acted as if they were, right? We live in a society where we're always being watched, and you can think about all the catalogs and so on and so forth we have. And in Foucault's analysis, right, the idea was, is if you remember back, like before when they punished crime, they didn't punish criminals. They didn't think about the world until we get to this modern era and the birth of prisons. People didn't think about it as like somebody who committed a crime had something wrong with them and we had to figure out why they did it, right? We instead thought of crime as crime was sort of like a declaration of war against the state, so the state declared war on you, which looked a lot like torture and murder, right? But like basically the idea wasn't like that person is a worse person, right? It was instead like the state sort of inflicting violence upon them, right, in retaliation. So we had crimes, and we had corporal punishment, we had crimes, but we didn't have any criminals. Criminals didn't exist as a concept. We're going to come back to that also again when we talk about biopolitics for our next article. But in this case, right, so like the government could kill somebody, right, but it didn't get to say whether their life was legitimate or not. It didn't get to make a statement about that. It wasn't a ruling about life, right? So according to Agamben, accompanying this sort of move to the prison is also this move in thinking about whose life is worth living or not. And she's going to connect in with that kind of like eugenics stuff. There's a lot of examples of that it's going to run. And so basically like the idea is like the court. Yeah.
So before this whole idea of a prison, Agamben thought that when punishing, well, we would say now a criminal, when punishing a criminal, they didn't see it as a criminal. They more felt like they were seeking justice for the action I was taking, like they weren't determining whether or not the person was worth living or not.
Yeah. Yeah. And that goes back to Foucault. Yeah, and that's pretty well documented, right? That like attitudes weren't as such that people were sitting around thinking about why people were doing it. There wasn't the baseline assumption wasn't that there was something worse about the person who committed a crime. It was just problematic that they did it, so they enacted upon it. Yeah. Yeah, that's totally what it is. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of examples of moments when now we ask the government to intercede. To basically decide whether somebody is alive, right? Whether it counts that people are alive. Or likewise, if they can be killed. And in fact, he sort of like Agamben, to explain this, sort of resurrects this old term from Roman law, where he talks about the homo saucer, which is somebody who can legally be killed, but not in the literal word is sacrificed, but essentially what he means by it is that they can be killed, but not executed. So the government can't execute somebody for something, but they can kill anybody who wants to can kill them. Right? And so like this weird indeterminate state is becoming, according to Agamben, more and more common as the government has the ability to decide whether people's lives are worth living. Okay, it's a lot of abstraction, I know that. But we'll take some concrete examples. Does anybody know what euthanasia is?
Isn't that something along the lines of like helping elderly people with self-assisted dying?
Yeah.
So it's like kind of exterminating the elderly.
Yeah, so this would be something like doctor-assisted suicide, right? What happens in a doctor-assisted suicide? Does anybody know? Yeah.
They usually like do something to the patient that kills them. I guess like there's no collision.
Yeah, and so like they do something for the patient that essentially puts them to death. And who do they do? Who does doctors do doctor-assisted suicide for usually? It's not legal here in the United States, but it is some places.
Is it people in comas?
People in comas, the people who are, usually you have to sign off, so it's usually terminally ill people, cancer patients, things like that. Okay, so is anybody familiar with the debate surrounding, or what happened with debates surrounding doctor-assisted suicide? This was a thing in the 90s. Yeah.
This is kind of a guess, but is it like, because a lot of assisted suicides are done to people who didn't consent themselves, but it's kind of like someone deciding that their quality of life is not worth living. So there might be like some debate over whether that's ethical at all, like deciding for someone whether they want to live or not.
Actually, most of the time doctor-assisted suicide is consented.
Okay.
So that's not really the issue per se in play.
Wasn't it more the fact that like the elderly really don't have much more to contribute to the world, so they're just kind of throwing up resources that can be used for other things?
No, it's not anything so cruel. So basically what happens is there's this person who pushes in the 1990s to try to get it legalized. And there's this sort of like huge legal debate. So in Agamben's world, Agamben isn't interested in which side of the debate you're on. What he's interested in is that we ask the government to do it. So like the government, like, so it's basically like, for Agamben, it's sort of like you turn to the government and you say, because traditionally what do we call it when you put somebody to sleep chemically? Like if I was to just put somebody to sleep chemically, what would happen to me? What would I, legally speaking, what would that be called?
Murder?
It'd be called murder, right? So basically if you want to think about it, traditionally putting anyone to death is murder. Right? They're looking for an exception to this law, right? That's essentially what they're asking for. So they turn to the government and they say, please government, allow me to have the right to kill someone. which is an interesting statement. Now, like going back to like Agamben's not going to push a political agenda on this, but it's an interesting phenomenon to ask the government to intercede on whether it should be allowed to kill someone.
Doesn't count the world of random. So you said physician assisted suicide is illegal in the United States, right?
Yeah.
So, do you know why it's like considered illegal? Is it because like it's considered murder, or?
Yeah, people objected to it. It became like same thing as like is anybody familiar with debates around like pulling the plug on coma patients? Are you guys familiar with this? A lot of people object to that as sort of like it's an ending of it's something unnatural to end life, right? It's the same sort of debate surrounding doctor-assisted suicide. Whether or not we should be able to take any action to end somebody's life early is debated, right? Yeah.
So then, how is the death penalty still such a thing?
Well, and there we go too. Actually, like and this is so death penalty debates are a great example too of what Agamben's talking about. Because before, when people committed the death penalty, it wasn't a statement about the quality of the person, right? But now, right, when we essentially are asking the government, right, that we retain the ability to make a judgment about whether this person should or should not be alive. In a lot of ways, and especially if you start taking into consideration things like the racial and class makeups of people who are on death row, you could argue that there's a quiet form of euthanasia attached to that statement, right? Or, not euthanasia, sorry, eugenics attached to that statement too, right? That we should essentially kill murderers. People on death row, because like if I commit murder as a white person, even if it's like egregious murder, I'm very unlikely to be put in the death penalty, even in states where they have the death penalty. But it's a lot more likely if you're a minority. Just statistically speaking, it's true. So almost identical crimes, but different outcomes, right? So here you get very much so, yeah. And so that's actually the slip that Agamben's interested in, right? How does this sort of like making a statement about life slip into something else, something a lot more dangerous? And will it, right, seems to be his question. So anybody familiar with any other examples of where we ask the government to decide what counts as living and not living?
With determining like at what age a fetus should be before you can abort it.
Yeah, abortion debates are another example of something that would wig Agamben out, right? So for Agamben, like the fact that who gets to decide whether or not somebody can be aborted? Is it a medical, ethical, philosophical discussion per se? What's the deciding factor? The law, right? So and that's his point. The same thing with that's another great example, right? And so Agamben isn't weirded out that people have the discussion of whether it's okay. What he's interested in is that then turning to the legal system and saying, make a law that allows me to right, is the moment that he gets kind of weirded out. Maybe familiar with another great debate for Agamben is anybody familiar with heart death versus brain death is a thing? So how traditionally have we decided whether somebody's dead?
Brain death?
Not brain death. That's traditionally not brain death. How do you feel? Wait, what's that?
No pulse.
No pulse, right? As long as you have a pulse, traditionally speaking, in most people's minds, you're still alive, right? So in the 1990s, were people aware that they changed the definition of what it meant to be dead, right? So that I can still have a functioning circulatory system, my heart can be beating, I can have a pulse, my organs can still be working, and I can still be dead, right? That essentially, if the brain ceases to work, right, then all of a sudden, that's the new definition of death, which was very practical. Doctors did this for very practical reasons. So Doctors did this mainly had to do with organ donation, right? So like, if you wait for somebody's heart to stop, you might be waiting long enough that the organs have actually deteriorated and become unusable. So they were in like, well, once you go brain dead, you're not coming back. So we will simply declare you dead and remove any care from you. That's what doctors wanted, right? What's interesting to it in Gallman isn't that we had the shift, right? But it's how that shift occurs, right? So then that's with all these things. So for him, it's not that we change, right? It's more that like you have vying factions arguing over. You have vying factions arguing for the government to make a decision about life. That's really kind of what Gallman is weirded out by. Does all that make sense? You see how that connects in with the eugenics stuff? How that connects in with disability? Because like, also like for Gallman, like things like forced sterilization, right, are also going to be this exact same thing, right? Because essentially you're saying if somebody can't reproduce, you're making a statement about the legitimacy of life. So the exact same thing is going on, right, behind both phenomena. So in a Gallman's world, right, that's a reduction, right, of people down to bare life. That's how we would refer to it. Okay, any questions or thoughts on that? Yeah.
I was, for the article about this therapist, I'm just curious, like,
Yeah.
is there big money on being like a perfect donor? Like, you get paid a lot if you're a really tall, like, alive, sperm donor?
Depending on the company, you can get paid more for having certain characteristics. Like, as long as they didn't have to have a picture of me, I'd probably make bank. I'm over 6 foot tall, I have a PhD. I play an instrument, like, this is doing pretty good. On paper. So much different than real life, no. Sorry, I probably shouldn't have made that joke. Anyways, yeah, that's true. Any other questions? Okay, I think we're going to end there since we only have 4 minutes left. So, rather than leap into the next article. So, make sure, and since it's been a little while, make sure you look back over the biopolitical embodiment of work in the era of human advancement. So make sure you look back over that. So we'll talk about post-humanism on Wednesday. And then I'm hoping to get through that. Well, if not, we'll get caught up sometime. You don't have to. Not going to rush. Thank you.